turn away from me," she sobbed, scarred and shivering in the bitter Wyoming wind. But the Sioux hunter knelt down and promised her something that would change both their lives forever. This is the story of Helena Ward, a woman whose face bore the marks of unimaginable tragedy, and Shappa, a warrior who saw beauty where others saw only broken dreams. In a world where scars told stories of survival, their love would become legend. Fort Bridger, Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1867. The frontier town sat like a weathered scar against the endless prairie, where the Union Pacific Railroad pushed westward and dreams died as often as they were born. Wood smoke drifted from countless chimneys, mixing with the dust kicked up by wagon wheels and the constant hammering of new construction. This was a place where civilization met wilderness, where order wrestled with chaos, and where the strong preyed upon the weak with ruthless efficiency. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy main street, illuminating a scene that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. Near the trading post, a small crowd had gathered around a makeshift platform where the territorial marshal conducted his monthly auctions. Today's offerings included livestock, farming equipment, and something far more troubling, something that made decent folk turn their eyes away and pretend they saw nothing wrong. On the platform stood three figures that would forever be burned into the memory of anyone who witnessed this moment. The first was Marshal Jeremiah Croft, a man whose badge had long since lost its meaning, whose authority had been corrupted by whiskey and greed. The second was Silas Ward, a broken-down gambler whose debts had finally caught up with him, whose desperation had led him to make choices that would haunt him forever. And the third was Helena Ward, his daughter. Standing in chains like property to be sold, Helena was 23 years old, though the suffering etched into her features made her appear both younger and older simultaneously. Her auburn hair, once lustrous and carefully maintained, now hung in tangled strands around a face that told a story of unimaginable pain. The left side of her face bore a massive scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, a twisted mass of pink and white tissue that pulled at her skin and gave her a permanent, haunting expression. Her dress, once fine blue cotton, was now torn and stained, hanging loosely on her diminished frame. But it was her eyes that captured the attention of anyone brave enough to look directly at her. They were the color of storm clouds, grey-green and filled with a depth of sorrow that seemed to have no bottom. These were the eyes of someone who had stared into hell and somehow found the strength to climb back out, only to discover that the world above was often just as cruel as the flames below. Marshal Croft cleared his throat and raised his voice above the murmur of the crowd, his words carrying the authority of law, even as they violated every principle of human decency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have here today the final item in the settlement of debts owed by one Silas Ward. Outstanding gambling debts, unpaid loans, and various other financial obligations have reached the sum of $800. A sum that Mr. Ward finds himself unable to pay through conventional means." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in understanding, while others whispered among themselves about the moral implications of what they were witnessing. In the frontier, debt was a serious matter, and the law provided few protections for those who found themselves unable to pay what they owed. Still, this seemed to cross a line that many had never imagined would be crossed in their community. Silas Ward stepped forward, his face a mask of shame and desperate justification. He was a man in his 50s who had aged badly, his once handsome features now puffy and red from too much drink and too little sleep. His clothes were expensive but wrinkled, marking him as someone who had once possessed wealth but had squandered it through poor choices and weaker character. When he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion, though whether from genuine remorse or simple fear was impossible to determine. "This here's my daughter Helena," he announced, his words slurring slightly despite the early hour. "She's been a burden to me since the fire took her looks and her prospects. No man in his right mind would marry her now, not with that face, so she's got no value as a wife. But she's strong, she can work, and she don't eat much. Whoever takes her off my hands will be getting a lifetime of service, and I'll be square with my debts. It's a fair trade, and it's legal under territorial law. A murmur ran through the crowd, a mixture of disgust and morbid fascination. Some people began to drift away, unwilling to be part of what was happening, while others pressed closer, drawn by the spectacle despite their better judgment. Helena stood perfectly still during her father's speech, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, as if she could will herself to be anywhere else in the world. "The bidding will start at $50, Marshal Croft announced, his voice betraying no emotion whatsoever. "This is a legal transaction sanctioned by territorial law and properly witnessed. The successful bidder will receive full ownership and responsibility for the Woman Helena Ward, including all rights and obligations pertaining thereto." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the gaps between buildings and the distant lowing of cattle in the stockyards. Then slowly, a few hands began to rise as men calculated the potential value of a lifetime of unpaid labor against the social stigma of participating in what was essentially a slave auction. The first bid came from Otto Kleinman, who owned a struggling farm outside town and desperately needed help with the endless work of frontier agriculture. $60, he called out, his accent thick with German pronunciation. "She looks strong enough for field work, and I need someone to help my wife with the cooking and cleaning." This opened the floodgates, and soon several other bidders joined in. There was Marcus Flynn, who ran a boarding house and saw Helena as unpaid kitchen help. There was Samuel Morrison, whose wife had died the previous winter and who needed someone to care for his 4 young children. Each bid was accompanied by a cold assessment of Helena's potential usefulness, as if she were livestock being evaluated for breeding or slaughter. As the bidding continued, Helena's composure began to crack. She had maintained her dignity through her father's betrayal and the marshal's cold officiating. But hearing herself discussed in terms of monetary value and labor potential finally broke through her defenses. Tears began to slide down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the dust and grime that had accumulated during her night in the jail cell. $120, called out a voice from the back of the crowd, and Helena's blood turned to ice. She recognized that voice immediately, though she had hoped never to hear it again. It belonged to Cornelius Blackwood, a wealthy rancher whose reputation for cruelty toward both animals and people was well known throughout the territory. Blackwood was a man who took pleasure in causing pain, who collected broken things simply for the joy of breaking them further. Blackwood pushed through the crowd, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden platform as he approached Helena with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and cold blue eyes that seemed to strip away pretense and expose the vulnerable core beneath. His smile was predatory as he reached out to touch Helena's scarred cheek, causing her to flinch away violently. "Turn away from me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please, just turn away." But Blackwood only laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made several people in the crowd wince with discomfort. "Oh, I don't think so, my dear. You're going to be my special project. I have such plans for you, such wonderful plans. We're going to have a lot of fun together, you and I." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Helena felt her knees begin to buckle. She had endured so much already, had survived things that would have destroyed weaker people, but the thought of being completely at Blackwood's mercy was more than she could bear. She closed her eyes and tried to find some place deep inside herself where she could retreat, some inner sanctuary where his cruelty couldn't reach. That was when the sound of hoofbeats cut through the tension like a knife through silk. Every head turned toward the edge of town, where a lone rider was approaching at a steady pace. Even from a distance, it was clear that this was no ordinary traveler. The horse was a magnificent paint stallion, black and white markings gleaming in the morning sun, and the rider sat with the easy grace of someone who had been born in the saddle, As the rider drew closer, details became visible that caused the crowd to shift uneasily. This was clearly a Native American warrior, his long black hair braided with feathers and leather cords, his clothing a mixture of traditional buckskin and practical frontier wear. He carried himself with quiet dignity and unmistakable strength, radiating a sense of controlled power that made even the most confident men in the crowd reconsider their assumptions about superiority. The warrior rode directly to the platform without hesitation, his dark eyes taking in the scene with quick intelligence. He saw the chains, the tears, the fear, and the predatory satisfaction on Blackwood's face. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. A subtle alteration in the balance of power that made everyone present suddenly aware that the game had changed. He dismounted with fluid grace and approached the platform, his moccasined feet making no sound on the wooden planks. When he spoke, his voice was deep and calm, carrying the authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to command respect. "I am Shapa of the Lakota people. I have come to make an offer." Marshal Croft blinked in surprise, clearly not having expected this development. "Now see here, Indian, this is a legal proceeding between white folks. You got no business here." Shapa's eyes fixed on the marshal with steady intensity, and Croft found himself taking an involuntary step backward. "I have gold," Shapa said simply, reaching into a leather pouch at his belt and producing several coins that gleamed in the sunlight. "I offer $200. The crowd gasped collectively. It was more money than most of them had ever seen at one time, certainly far more than anyone had expected to be offered for Helena. Even Blackwood looked taken aback, though his expression quickly hardened into something ugly and dangerous. "The hell you will!" Blackwood snarled, pushing past Marshal Croft to confront Shapa directly. "I don't know what kind of savage custom you think you're following here, but civilized folks don't sell their women to heathens. Find yourself a squaw from your own kind and leave decent white women alone." Shapa regarded Blackwood with the same calm intensity he had shown the marshal, seemingly unbothered by the insults and threats. "The woman is suffering," he said quietly. "I offer her protection and respect. Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and for a moment the entire crowd held its breath. Everyone present knew Blackwood's reputation, knew what fate awaited Helena if he succeeded in his bid. But the racial prejudices of the frontier ran deep, and the idea of a white woman being purchased by a Native American challenged assumptions that many in the crowd weren't prepared to question. It was Helena herself who broke the deadlock. She had been listening to the exchange with growing amazement, hardly daring to believe that someone, anyone, was willing to stand up to Blackwood on her behalf. When she looked at Shapa, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen from another human being in years, genuine compassion. "Please," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "Please, I accept his offer." Silas Ward stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You don't get a say in this, girl. You're being sold to pay my debts, and I'll decide who gets you. I won't have my daughter living with some savage, no matter how much gold he's got." But Shapa had heard enough. In one smooth motion, he poured the contents of his pouch onto the platform, and the sound of gold coins hitting wood was like thunder in the sudden silence. There was more money there than anyone had imagined, enough to pay Silas's debts several times over. $500, Shapa announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "More than enough to settle all debts and obligations. The woman comes with me, or the offer is withdrawn." Marshal Croft stared at the pile of gold, his mind racing as he calculated the legal implications and political ramifications of the situation. On one hand, the law clearly stated that debts could be settled through such transactions, and Shapa's offer was more than generous. On the other hand, the racial tensions in the territory were already running high, and this could easily spark the kind of violence that would bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities. Finally, greed won out over prejudice, as it so often did on the frontier. "The offer is accepted," Croft announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "The debt is settled, and the woman Helena Ward is legally transferred to the custody of Shappa of the Lakota people." Blackwood's face turned purple with rage, and his hand moved toward the gun at his hip. But Shappa was already moving, faster than thought, and suddenly Blackwood found himself staring down the blade of a knife that had appeared in the warrior's hand. As if by magic, the blade was pressed against his throat, not quite breaking the skin, but making its message unmistakably clear. "The transaction is complete," Shappa said quietly, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made even the bravest men in the crowd reconsider any thoughts of interference. "The woman is under my protection now. Any who would harm her must go through me first." For a long moment the two men stared at each other, predator and protector locked in a battle of wills that could easily have erupted into violence. Finally Blackwood stepped back, his hand moving away from his weapon, though his eyes promised that this confrontation was far from over. Shappa turned away from Blackwood as if the man had ceased to exist, focusing his attention entirely on Helena. She stood frozen on the platform, hardly able to believe that her ordeal was finally over, that she was free from both her father's betrayal and Blackwood's threats. When Shappa approached her, she instinctively turned her scarred cheek away, the old shame rising like a tide, despite everything that had just happened. "Turn away from me," she whispered, the words coming automatically after years of rejection and disgust. "Please, just turn away from the ugliness." But Shappa did something that no one had done since the fire that had changed her life forever. He gently placed his fingers under her chin and turned her face toward him, looking directly at her scars, without flinching, without revulsion, without pity. His dark eyes met hers with steady warmth, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "I see no ugliness," he said softly. "I see a warrior who has survived great pain. I see strength that has been tested by fire and emerged unbroken. I see beauty that goes deeper than skin, deeper than scars, deeper than the shallow judgments of shallow people." Helena felt something break open inside her chest, some wall that she had built to protect herself from further hurt. Tears began to flow again, but these were different tears. Tears of relief and gratitude and something that she had thought was lost to her forever. Hope. Shappa removed the chains from her wrists with surprising gentleness, his calloused fingers careful not to cause any additional pain to her already abraded skin. Then he removed his own cloak, a beautiful piece of work made from buffalo hide, and decorated with intricate beadwork, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate and comforting, but it was more than physical warmth. It was the warmth of acceptance, of protection, of belonging. "Come," he said simply, offering her his hand. "We go home now." Helena looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, hardly daring to reach for it. It represented so many things. Freedom from her past, hope for her future, and most frighteningly of all, the possibility of trust. She had been betrayed by everyone who should have protected her, sold like an animal by the father who should have loved her. How could she possibly trust this stranger, no matter how kind he seemed? But as she looked into Shappa's eyes, she saw something that decided the matter for her. She saw patience. He wasn't demanding her trust, wasn't rushing her decision, wasn't treating her choice as if it belonged to him. He was simply offering and waiting and making it clear that whatever she decided would be respected. Slowly, carefully, Helena reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with gentle strength, and for the first time in years, she felt truly safe. Together, they walked toward his horse, leaving behind the crowd of watchers, the platform of shame, and the life that had brought her nothing but pain. As Shappa helped her mount his horse, settling her securely in front of him, Helena caught a glimpse of her father's face in the crowd. Silas Ward was staring at the pile of gold coins with an expression of mixed satisfaction and regret, already calculating how quickly he could lose this newfound wealth at the poker tables. He didn't even look at his daughter as she rode away, didn't acknowledge that he had just sold his own flesh and blood to pay for his gambling debts. But Helena found that she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she was riding towards something instead of running away from it. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if this Lakota warrior would prove to be the protector he claimed to be, or just another predator with better manners. But she knew that anything was better than the life she was leaving behind, and for now that was enough. The last thing the crowd saw as the dust settled was Helena Ward disappearing into the wilderness, wrapped in a buffalo cloak and riding away with a Sioux hunter who had seen past her scars to the woman beneath. Some shook their heads in disgust, others whispered prayers for her safety. But all of them knew they had witnessed something unprecedented in the harsh social order of the frontier. And as Fort Bridger faded behind them into the vast expanse of the Wyoming Territory, Helena Ward began the most important journey of her life, riding toward a destiny that would challenge everything she had ever believed about love, trust, and the possibility of redemption in a world that had shown her precious little of any of those things. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats against the hard-packed earth created a steady drumbeat that seemed to match Helena's racing heart as they rode away from Fort Bridger. With each mile that passed, the oppressive weight of her former life lifted slightly, though she remained tense in Shappa's arms, uncertain of what lay ahead. The buffalo cloak wrapped around her shoulders carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, foreign yet oddly comforting, like a promise of warmth in a world that had shown her nothing but cold indifference. Shappa rode with the easy confidence of a man who knew every rock, every stream, every hidden path in this vast wilderness. His strong arms formed a protective circle around Helena without making her feel trapped or confined, a delicate balance that spoke to his understanding of wounded creatures. Behind them, the smoke from Fort Bridger's chimneys grew fainter until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the endless expanse of prairie grass and rolling hills that stretched toward distant mountains. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Helena was too overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances to form coherent thoughts, while Shappa seemed to understand that she needed time to process what had happened. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but rather filled with unspoken questions and tentative hopes. Helena found herself stealing glances at the man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to voice. His face was strong and angular, with high cheekbones that spoke of noble heritage and dark eyes that seemed to see everything without judgment. His long black hair was braided with small bones and feathers, each one telling a story she couldn't yet read. There was a scar running along his jaw, barely visible beneath his bronze skin, evidence that he too had known violence and survived it. Most remarkably, when he looked at her, his gaze never wavered from her eyes, never dropped to examine her disfigured cheek with the morbid curiosity she had grown to expect. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the landscape, Shappa guided his horse toward a small grove of cottonwood trees that clustered around a clear-running stream. The sound of water bubbling over smooth stones was like music after the harsh voices and cruel laughter of the auction. Here, surrounded by nature's beauty, the ugly transaction that had freed her seemed like something from a nightmare rather than a memory that was only hours old. "We rest here," Shappa said, his voice breaking the peaceful silence. "The horse needs water, and you need time to think." He dismounted with fluid grace and turned to help Helena down from the horse's back. For a moment, she hesitated, remembering how other men's hands had felt when they touched her, rough and possessive and painful. But when Shappa's hands encircled her waist, they were gentle and respectful, lifting her carefully and setting her down as if she were made of precious glass that might shatter at the slightest mishandling. Helena's legs were unsteady beneath her, partly from the long ride, but mostly from the emotional upheaval of the morning. She swayed slightly, and Shappa's hand moved to steady her elbow, but he released her the moment she regained her balance. Even that small gesture spoke volumes about his character. showing a consideration for her autonomy that she had never experienced before. While Shappa tended to his horse, removing the saddle and bridle to let the magnificent animal drink and graze freely, Helena found herself drawn to the stream's edge. The water was so clear she could see smooth pebbles on the bottom, and for the first time in months she felt an overwhelming desire to be clean. Her face and hands were grimy from her night in the jail cell, and her dress was stained with sweat and fear. "The water is safe," Shappa said, noticing her longing gaze. "Clean and cold from the mountain snow. You may wash if you wish." Helena looked up at him, surprised by his perceptiveness. "You won't look?" "I will tend to the fire and prepare food," he replied, already turning away to give her privacy. "Call if you need anything." The simple respect he showed her was almost overwhelming. Helena had grown so accustomed to being stared at, either with revulsion at her scars or with the cold calculation of men evaluating her potential usefulness, that his courtesy felt like a gift beyond price. She watched as he gathered dry wood with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and purposeful. Alone by the stream, Helena knelt at the water's edge and cupped the cold liquid in her hands, splashing it over her face and neck. The shock of the temperature made her gasp, but it was a clean, honest sensation that seemed to wash away more than just the physical grime. As she scrubbed at her hands and arms, she found herself thinking about the morning's events with a clarity that had been impossible while they were happening. Her father had sold her like livestock, caring more about his gambling debts than his daughter's welfare. The thought should have brought tears, but instead, Helena felt a strange sense of liberation. For years, she had tried to be the dutiful daughter, accepting his blame for the fire that had scarred her, believing his cruel words about her worthlessness. Now finally, she was free of his poisonous influence, though the scars he had left on her soul would take much longer to heal than those on her face. As she dried her hands on a relatively clean section of her dress, Helena became aware of wonderful smells drifting from Shappa's small fire. He had produced fresh bread from his saddlebags, along with strips of dried meat and some kind of tea that smelled of herbs and honey. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the previous day. "Come," Shappa called softly. "Food is ready." Helena approached the fire hesitantly, still uncertain of her place in this new dynamic. Shappa had spread a blanket on the ground and arranged the food with care, even producing a tin cup for the tea. When she sat down across from him, maintaining what she hoped was a respectful distance, he handed her a portion of bread with some of the dried meat. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. Shappa nodded acknowledgement, but said nothing more, allowing her to eat in peace. The food was simple but delicious, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but which complemented the smoky flavor of the meat perfectly. The tea was warm and soothing, with a slight sweetness that reminded her of wildflower honey. As they ate, Helena found herself stealing glances at her rescuer, trying to understand what motivated him to help a stranger, especially one whose appearance made most people uncomfortable. Everything about him spoke of quiet strength and deep wisdom, from the way he moved with unconscious grace to the patient manner in which he waited for her to speak first. "Why did you help me?" she finally asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since he had first appeared at the auction. Shappa considered her words for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames of the fire. "In my tribe, we believe that all beings are connected, that the suffering of one affects the whole. When I saw your pain, I felt it as my own. But I'm not of your people," Helena protested. "I'm white, and my people have not been kind to yours." "The color of skin does not determine the color of the heart," Shappa replied simply. "You were in need, and I had the means to help." Nothing else mattered. His words were so matter-of-fact, so free of the racial hatred that poisoned so many interactions on the frontier, that Helena felt tears pricking at her eyes. She had grown so accustomed to being judged by her appearance, both her race and her scars, that his acceptance felt almost too good to be true. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happens now? She asked, voicing her greatest fear. What do you expect from me? Shappa's expression softened slightly, and for the first time she saw what might have been a hint of sadness in his eyes. I expect nothing. You are free to choose your own path. If you wish to return to your people, I will take you to the nearest settlement. If you wish to stay with me, you will be welcome in my village. But the choice is yours alone. The simple offer of choice, something that had been denied to her for so long, was almost overwhelming. Helena had been controlled by her father's demands, limited by society's expectations, and trapped by her own shame for years. The idea that she could actually decide her own future was both thrilling and terrifying. Your village, she said carefully. Would they accept someone like me? Someone who looks like this? Shappa's eyes met hers directly, holding her gaze with steady warmth. My people judge by actions, not appearances. They would see a woman who has survived great trials and emerged with her spirit intact. They would honor your strength. Helena touched her scarred cheek self-consciously, a gesture that had become automatic over the years. Most people see only ugliness when they look at me. Then most people are blind, Shappa said with quiet conviction. Scars are proof of survival, evidence of strength. They tell stories of battles fought and won. There is no shame in bearing them. His words hit her like a physical blow, so different from everything she had been taught to believe about herself. For years, she had been told that her scars made her hideous, unmarriageable, worthless. But here was this man, this warrior from a completely different culture, telling her that her scars were marks of honor rather than shame. How can you say that? She whispered, her voice breaking slightly. How can you look at me and not see the monster that I've become? Shappa set down his cup and leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. Tell me about the fire, he said gently. Tell me how you got those scars. Helena's first instinct was to refuse, to change the subject as she always did when people asked about her past. But something in Shappa's manner, the patient acceptance in his eyes, made her want to speak. Perhaps it was time to stop carrying the burden of her secrets alone. I was 15, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. My mother had been sick for months with consumption, barely able to leave her bed. My father spent most of his time at the saloons, drinking away what little money we had. I was trying to take care of everything, the cooking, the cleaning, nursing my mother. She paused, closing her eyes as the memories flooded back with painful clarity. One night, my mother was having trouble breathing, coughing up blood. I was making her some broth, trying to get something warm into her, when I heard my father come home. He was drunk again, angrier than usual, because he'd lost heavily at poker. Shappa remained perfectly still, listening without judgment as she continued her story. He started yelling at my mother, blaming her for being sick, for costing him money. When I tried to defend her, he backhanded me so hard I fell against the stove. The pot of broth spilled, and burning liquid splashed across my face and down my neck. Helena's hand moved unconsciously to her scars, tracing the familiar pattern of twisted skin. The pain was incredible, like nothing I had ever felt. I was screaming, my mother was crying, and my father was shouting that it was my own fault for being clumsy. He wouldn't even let me put cold water on the burns, said I needed to learn my lesson. Your father did nothing to help you? Shappa asked, his voice carefully controlled. Worse than nothing, Helena replied bitterly. When the burns got infected and I developed fever, he told everyone it was God's punishment for my vanity. He said I had been too proud of my appearance, and this was divine justice. Even when the doctor said I might die without proper treatment, my father refused to pay for medicine. Shappa's hands had clenched into fists, though his expression remained calm. And your mother? She died 3 weeks later, Helena said, tears finally beginning to flow. I always wondered if the shock of seeing me burned hastened her death. My father certainly thought so. He never let me forget that I had killed the only woman he ever loved. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of pain and self-doubt. Helena had never told anyone the complete story before, had carried the burden of guilt and shame alone for 8 long years. Speaking the truth aloud felt like lancing a festering wound, painful but ultimately healing. When Shapa spoke again, his voice carried a depth of emotion that surprised her. "Your father is a fool and a coward," he said with quiet intensity. "You were a child, trying to care for a dying woman while he drowned his responsibilities in whiskey. The accident was not your fault, and your mother's death was not your fault. You have carried blame that was never yours to bear." Helena looked up at him through her tears, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "But if I hadn't been so clumsy, if your father had been a man instead of a drunken weakling, none of it would have happened," Shapa interrupted firmly. "If he had cared for his family instead of his gambling, your mother would have had proper medical attention, and you would have been safe from harm. The fault lies with him, not with a 15-year-old girl trying to keep her family together." The absolute conviction in his voice broke something loose inside Helena's chest, some tight knot of self-hatred that had been choking her for years. She had spent so long accepting blame that wasn't hers, believing lies about her own worth, that hearing the truth spoken with such certainty felt like a revelation. "I've been so angry," she whispered, surprising herself with the admission. "Not just at my father, but at God, at the world, at myself. I've spent 8 years hating my own reflection, believing I deserved to be alone and unloved." "Anger is natural," Shapa said gently, "but it becomes poison if you hold it too long. My people have a saying, a man who carries anger is like a man who grasps a burning coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. He is the one who gets burned." Helena wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dust on her cheeks. "How do you let go of something that's been part of you for so long?" "Slowly," Shapa replied. "One day at a time, one choice at a time, and not alone. Healing is easier when there are others to share the burden." As if summoned by his words, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the prairie. Shapa looked up and smiled slightly, as if the bird had delivered a message meant just for him. "That is Wakinyano Yate, the Thunder Being's messenger. He says the storm is passing and clear skies are coming." Helena followed his gaze, watching the magnificent bird ride the wind currents with effortless grace. There was something peaceful about the sight, something that spoke of freedom and endless possibilities. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around hiding from the world. "If I came with you to your village," she said carefully, "what would be expected of me? I don't know your customs, your language, your ways of doing things. You would learn as all children learn through watching and doing," Shapa replied. "My people are patient teachers, and there is no shame in not knowing what you have never been taught. As for what would be expected, only that you contribute what you can and respect the harmony of the community. And if I couldn't adapt, if I was too different, too damaged?" Shapa's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the first hint of amusement she had seen from him. "Everyone is damaged in some way. The trick is learning how to make your broken pieces fit together in a way that still works. My grandmother always said that the most beautiful pots are the ones that have been cracked and mended with gold." His words painted a picture so different from the harsh judgment of white society that Helena felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Could there really be a place where her scars would be seen as proof of strength rather than evidence of unworthiness? Could she possibly find acceptance among people who had every reason to distrust and despise her race? As if reading her thoughts, Shapa added quietly, "There will be those in my village who question my decision to bring a white woman among us. Some have lost family members to your people's bullets and diseases. Their anger is as real and justified as yours. But my word carries weight, and once they see your heart, They will understand why I chose to help you. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded Helena of her mother's favorite dress. It seemed appropriate somehow, as if her mother's spirit was giving her blessing to this new beginning. Helena had spent so many years living in the shadow of her past that she had forgotten how to hope for the future. "I would like to see your village," she said finally, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "I would like to learn your ways, if you think your people would have me." Shapa's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his serious features with warmth and joy. "They will have you," he said with quiet confidence, "and you will find that home is not a place on a map, but a feeling in your heart. You have been homeless long enough, Helena Ward. It is time for you to come home." 3 days of riding through increasingly wild and beautiful country had brought them to the edge of Shapa's territory, where the rolling prairie gave way to foothills covered in pine and aspen. Helena had never seen landscapes so magnificent, with crystal streams cascading down rocky slopes and eagles soaring overhead in endless blue skies. Each mile they traveled seemed to take her further from the civilized world she had known and deeper into a realm where different rules applied. Where the harsh judgments of white society held no power, the transformation in Helena during those 3 days had been remarkable to witness. Away from the cruel stares and whispered comments that had plagued her in Fort Bridger, she had begun to relax in ways that surprised even herself. Her shoulders no longer hunched defensively forward, and she had stopped automatically turning her scarred cheek away when Shapa spoke to her. The constant tension that had been her companion for 8 years was slowly melting away like snow in spring sunshine. Shapa had proved to be an ideal traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and wildlife with the enthusiasm of someone sharing treasured secrets. He taught her the names of plants and birds in his native tongue, laughing gently at her attempts to master the unfamiliar sounds. His patience seemed unlimited, and his respect for her dignity never wavered, even when helping her down from the horse or offering assistance with difficult terrain. On the morning of the 4th day, they crested a ridge, and Helena gasped at the sight that spread below them. Nestled in a protected valley beside a wide, clear river was a collection of teepees and earth lodges that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself. Smoke rose lazily from cooking fires, horses grazed in carefully tended meadows, and people moved about their daily tasks with the unhurried grace of those who lived in harmony with their environment. "Welcome to my home," Shapa said quietly, pride evident in his voice. "This is the village of the Mythical, the planters by the water. We have lived in this valley for 7 generations, and it has provided everything we need to thrive." Helena stared in wonder at the scene below, so different from the dusty, chaotic settlements she had known. Everything seemed to have its proper place, from the carefully organized lodge circles to the communal areas, where women worked together processing hides and preparing food. Children played freely between the lodges, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze like music. As they began their descent into the valley, Helena noticed that their approach had been observed. People emerged from their lodges to watch the newcomers, and she could feel the weight of dozens of curious eyes upon her. Her old instincts kicked in, and she found herself turning her face away, trying to hide her scars from view. "Look up," Shapa said gently. "Let them see you as you are. You have nothing to be ashamed of." Taking a deep breath, Helena lifted her chin and met the gazes of the people watching their arrival. To her surprise, she saw no revulsion or disgust in their faces, only natural curiosity about the stranger their kinsman had brought among them. Some of the children pointed and whispered, but it seemed to be simple childhood wonder rather than the cruel mockery she had grown to expect. As they rode through the village, Shapa called out greetings in his native language, and many people responded with warm smiles and raised hands. An elderly woman emerged from one of the larger lodges, her silver hair braided with ornate beadwork, and her weathered face creased with what Helena was learning to recognize as Lakota humor. This had to be someone of importance, given the respectful way others deferred to her presence. Unchi, Shapa said. Using what Helena had learned was the term for grandmother, though not necessarily indicating blood relation. I have brought a guest who seeks healing and a new beginning. The elderly woman approached their horse with surprising agility for her age, her keen dark eyes studying Helena with unconcealed interest. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of one accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Though her tone was kind rather than stern, I am Winona, keeper of this village's stories and healer of wounded spirits, she said in accented but clear English. Shapa tells me you have traveled far and suffered much. You are welcome here, daughter, but know that healing requires courage as well as time. Helena found herself looking directly into the old woman's eyes, drawn by the warmth and wisdom she saw there. Thank you for your kindness, she managed to say. I don't know what I can offer in return for your hospitality. Winona's weathered face crinkled into a smile. Every person brings gifts, even when they don't know what those gifts are. Time will reveal what you have to offer. For now, come and rest. You look as though you have been carrying heavy burdens for far too long. Shapa helped Helena dismount, and she found herself surrounded by a small group of women who seemed genuinely interested in making her comfortable. They spoke among themselves in rapid Lakota, occasionally including Helena, with smiles and gestures that needed no translation. Despite the language barrier, their intent was clearly friendly, and Helena felt some of her tension beginning to ease. A young woman about Helena's own age stepped forward, her glossy black braids decorated with small silver ornaments that caught the sunlight. She was strikingly beautiful, with high cheekbones and expressive dark eyes, but more importantly, her smile seemed entirely genuine as she extended her hand in the white custom of greeting. I am Ayana, she said in careful English. I help Winona with healing work. Shapa sent word ahead that you might be coming, and we have prepared a place for you to stay while you decide what path you wish to follow. Helena shook the offered hand, marveling at the casual acceptance these people showed toward a complete stranger. I'm Helena. I don't know your customs or your language, but I'm willing to learn if you're willing to teach. Siana's smile broadened. Learning is the best way to honor a new home. Come, I will show you where you can rest and clean yourself properly. Then when you are ready, Winona wishes to speak with you about your journey and your hopes for the future. As they walked through the village, Helena noticed details that spoke to the careful organization and deep wisdom of these people. The lodges were positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks and drainage, while still allowing for easy communication between families. Gardens flourished in protected spots, growing corn, beans, and squash in the traditional pattern that maximized both nutrition and soil health. Children ran freely but respectfully, clearly taught from an early age to consider the needs of the community alongside their own desires. Women worked together on various tasks, their conversation punctuated by laughter and the sharing of advice. Men maintained weapons and tools with the kind of meticulous care that spoke to their role as protectors and providers. Your village is beautiful, Helena said sincerely. Everything seems so peaceful, so well ordered. Order comes from understanding everyone's place and role, Ayana replied. But it is not rigid order. We adapt as circumstances require, always seeking balance between individual needs and community good. It is a way of living that your people might find strange. Helena thought of Fort Bridger with its constant conflict and competition, where the strong preyed upon the weak without consequence. My people could learn much from yours, she said quietly. Ayana led her to a small but comfortable tipi that had been erected near the river's edge, positioned to provide both privacy and easy access to water. Inside, Helena found buffalo robes arranged for sleeping, a small fire pit for warmth, and various containers holding what appeared to be personal care items. This is yours for as long as you need it, Ayana explained. The women have provided soap made from yucca root, which is gentle on sensitive skin and clothing more suitable for our climate than what you are wearing. When you are ready, come to Winona's lodge. She has much experience helping people find their way after great loss. Alone for the first time since leaving Fort Bridger, Helena sat on one of the buffalo robes and tried to process everything that had happened. 4 days ago, she had been a piece of property being sold to pay her father's debts. Now she was an honored guest in a community that seemed to value kindness and wisdom above wealth or status. The clothing Ayana had mentioned was beautifully crafted from soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns that seemed to tell stories. Helena had never worn anything so fine, and when she put on the dress, she was amazed at how comfortable and practical it was. The high neckline and long sleeves provided coverage for her scars while still allowing freedom of movement. After washing in the river and braiding her hair in a simple style that kept it out of her face, Helena made her way to Winona's lodge. The structure was larger than most, with symbols painted on the hide walls that seemed to glow in the late afternoon light. When she announced herself, Winona's voice invited her to enter. The interior of the lodge was warm and welcoming, filled with the scent of sage and sweet grass. Winona sat beside a small fire, working on what appeared to be a complex piece of beadwork. She gestured for Helena to sit across from her, then set aside her work and fixed her guest with a penetrating stare. "Tell me about your pain," Winona said, without preamble. "Not the scars on your face, which are obvious, but the scars on your spirit, which are often deeper and harder to heal." Helena was taken aback by the directness of the question, but something about Winona's manner made evasion seem both impossible and pointless. "I've spent 8 years believing I was worthless," she said slowly. "My father told me I was cursed, that no man would ever want me, that I brought nothing but trouble to everyone around me. And you believed these lies because they came from someone who should have protected you," Winona observed. "The wounds inflicted by family cut deepest because we expect love from those who share our blood." Helena nodded, surprised by how accurately the old woman had identified the source of her deepest pain. "How do you know so much about healing hearts?" "Because I was once broken myself," Winona replied matter-of-factly. "When I was younger than you are now, soldiers came to our winter camp. They killed my husband and my 2 sons, burned our lodges, scattered our horse herds. I survived, but I wished I had died with them." The casual way Winona spoke of such devastating loss left Helena speechless. She had thought her own suffering was unique, but here was someone who had endured far worse and somehow found the strength to help others heal. "For 3 years I carried nothing but hatred and despair," Winona continued. "I spoke to no one, ate only what was forced upon me, wished for death every morning when I woke. The people of my village cared for me as they would care for a sick child, waiting for my spirit to return from the dark place where it had fled." "What brought you back?" Helena asked softly. "A vision quest," Winona replied. "My brother finally forced me to go into the wilderness to seek guidance from the spirits. I was angry with him, angry with the Creator, angry with life itself. But after 4 days without food or water, when I was ready to die, I had a dream." The old woman's eyes grew distant as she remembered. "I saw my husband and sons standing in a beautiful meadow filled with flowers. They were healthy and whole, and they were smiling. My eldest son spoke to me and said, 'Mother, we are at peace.' But you are choosing to live in the darkness when you could choose to live in the light. Our love for you has not ended, but your love for yourself must begin again." Helena felt tears pricking at her eyes as she listened to Winona's story. "And that changed everything?" "Not everything, and not immediately," Winona said with a slight smile. "Healing is not magic, child. It is work, hard work that must be chosen every day. But the vision showed me that I could honor my lost loved ones by helping others who were lost. I could transform my pain into medicine for wounded spirits. Is that what you're offering me?" Helena asked. "Medicine for my wounded spirit?" I'm offering you truth, Winona replied. You are not worthless. You are not cursed. You are not responsible for the cruelty of others or the accidents of fate. You are a woman of strength and courage who has survived terrible trials. Now you must learn to see yourself as the Creator sees you, not as your father taught you to see yourself. The words hit Helena like physical blows, each one chipping away at the wall of self-hatred she had built around her heart. I don't know how to do that, she whispered. I don't know how to stop hating what I see in the mirror. Then we will teach you, Winona said simply. It will not be easy, and it will not be quick. But if you are willing to do the work, we will help you find your way back to yourself. Over the following days, Helena began to experience life in the Lakota village in ways that challenged everything she thought she knew about community and belonging. She was assigned simple tasks that contributed to the group's welfare, starting with helping the women prepare food and tend to the children. At first, she was clumsy and uncertain, but no one showed impatience with her mistakes. The children in particular seemed drawn to her despite her scars. They would follow her around the village, chattering in Lakota and English, teaching her words and games with the unconscious generosity of youth. One little girl named Taka, whose name meant deer, seemed especially attached to Helena, often bringing her wildflowers or pretty stones she had found. Why do the children like me? Helena asked Ayana one evening as they worked together preparing hides for winter clothing. They don't seem bothered by my appearance. Children see with their hearts, not their eyes, Ayana explained. They sense your gentleness, your sadness, your need for friendship. Adults often lose that ability, but children are still wise enough to recognize a kindred spirit. Helena found this perspective both comforting and challenging. If children could see past her scars to her essential self, perhaps other people could learn to do the same. But it would require her to believe in her own worth first, something that still felt impossible most days. The turning point came during her second week in the village, when a group of warriors returned from a hunting expedition with disturbing news. They had encountered a cavalry patrol near the territorial border, and the soldiers had been asking questions about a missing white woman who had been kidnapped by savages. The description they gave matched Helena perfectly. "It's my father," Helena said when Shapa brought her the news. "He must have convinced the authorities that I was taken against my will. He's probably hoping to get his gold back, or maybe he's working with Blackwood to cause trouble for your people." Shapa's expression was grim as he considered the implications. "The soldiers will not care about the truth if they believe one of their women is being held captive. They will come here with guns and demands, and blood will be shed." Helena felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on her shoulders. Once again, her presence was bringing danger to innocent people. "I should leave," she said quietly. "I should go back and tell them the truth, that I came here willingly. And do you think they will believe the word of a scarred woman over the lies of white men?" Winona interjected, having overheard the conversation. "You would be condemning yourself to return to a life of misery, and the soldiers would still find reasons to make trouble for us." "Then what do we do?" Helena asked, feeling trapped between impossible choices. It was Shapa who provided the answer, his voice quiet but determined. "We prepare for whatever comes, and we stand together. You are part of our community now, Helena. We do not abandon our own when trouble comes calling." The simple declaration of belonging hit Helena harder than any physical blow. For the first time in her adult life, someone was claiming her as family, offering protection not out of pity or obligation, but out of genuine care. The knowledge that she was not alone, that she had people willing to fight for her, was both terrifying and wonderful. As the village prepared for the possibility of conflict, Helena found herself assigned to help with the children and elderly, ensuring they would be safe if violence erupted. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but also strangely empowering. These people trusted her with their most precious members, saw her as capable and reliable despite her limited experience with their ways. The night before the expected arrival of the cavalry patrol, Helena sat by the river with Winona, watching the stars reflect in the dark water. The old woman had been teaching her traditional songs and stories, helping her understand the spiritual beliefs that gave the Lakota such strength in the face of adversity. "Are you afraid?" Winona asked gently. Helena considered the question carefully. "Yes," she said finally, "but not in the way I used to be afraid. I used to fear that I was worthless, that I deserved whatever pain came my way. Now I fear that I might lose something precious, something worth fighting for." Winona smiled in the darkness. "That is the fear of someone who has learned to value herself. It is a healthy fear, one that will give you strength when you need it most." As they sat in comfortable silence, Helena reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. She was still the same woman who had been sold at auction in Fort Bridger, still bore the same scars that had marked her as damaged goods in white society. But something fundamental had shifted inside her, some recognition of her own worth that no amount of cruelty could completely destroy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, possibly violence, certainly difficult choices. But tonight, surrounded by people who had chosen to include her in their circle of protection, Helena Ward finally understood what it meant to belong somewhere. For the first time in 8 years, she was home. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern mountains when the sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley like thunder rolling across the plains. Helena stood with the other women and children on a hill overlooking the village, her heart pounding as she watched a column of blue-uniformed cavalry soldiers ride into view. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in their formation, the way their hands rested near their weapons. Ready for violence at the first sign of resistance, Captain Marcus Thornfield led the patrol with the rigid bearing of a career military man who had spent too many years fighting Indian wars on the frontier. His weathered face bore the permanent scowl of someone who saw enemies everywhere, and his pale eyes held the cold calculation of a man who viewed all Native Americans as obstacles to be removed rather than people to be respected. Behind him rode 20 seasoned troopers, their Spencer rifles gleaming in the morning light. Helena watched as Shapa and the other village leaders walked out to meet the soldiers, their movements deliberate and non-threatening, despite the weapons they carried. She could see the careful diplomacy in their posture, the way they positioned themselves to show strength without appearing aggressive. These were men who understood that one wrong word or gesture could ignite a conflict that would destroy everything they held dear. "Stay hidden," Winona whispered to Helena, placing a restraining hand on her arm as she started to move forward. "Let our men handle this first. If they need you to speak, they will call for you. But revealing yourself too soon could make things worse for everyone." From their concealed position, Helena could hear the conversation taking place below, though the distance made individual words difficult to distinguish. Captain Thornfield's voice carried clearly, however, its harsh tone leaving no doubt about his intentions. He was not here for negotiation or peaceful discussion. He was here to retrieve what he considered stolen property. "I am Captain Thornfield of the United States Army," the officer announced in a voice that brooked no argument. "I'm here on official business regarding the kidnapping of a white woman named Helena Ward. We have reliable information that she is being held in this village against her will." Shapa stepped forward, his own voice calm, but carrying the authority of a war chief speaking for his people. "I am Shapa, and I welcome you to our village in peace. No one is held here against their will. All who live among us do so by choice, including any white visitors we may have." Captain Thornfield's expression darkened at what he clearly considered evasion. "I don't have time for Indian double talk. The woman was taken from Fort Bridger 3 weeks ago by one of your warriors. Her father has demanded military intervention to secure her return." "Her father?" Shapper repeated, and Helena could hear the contempt in his voice, even from her hiding place. The same man who sold his daughter to pay gambling debts? The same man who watched her suffer for years without lifting a finger to help? The captain's face flushed red with anger at this challenge to his assumptions. What a father does with his property is his own business. What matters is that a white woman is being held by savages, and I'm here to take her back where she belongs. It was at this moment that Helena made a decision that would change everything. Despite Winona's restraining hand and the urgent whispers of the other women, she stood up and began walking down the hill toward the confrontation. She could feel every eye in the village turning toward her, could sense the collective intake of breath as her choice became clear. "There's no need for threats or violence," Helena called out, her voice carrying across the valley with surprising strength. "I'm Helena Ward, and I'm here by my own choice." The transformation in Captain Thornfield's demeanor was immediate and telling. His angry scowl softened into what he probably thought was paternal concern, though Helena could see the calculating coldness behind his eyes. This was a man who had already decided how this story would end, regardless of what she might say. "Miss Ward," he said, dismounting and approaching her with exaggerated gentleness. "Thank God you're alive. Your father has been beside himself with worry ever since you were taken. We're here to bring you home safely." Helena almost laughed at the absurdity of the lie. Her father had never worried about her safety in his life, had in fact been the source of most of the danger she had faced. But she could see that Captain Thornfield either believed the fiction or found it convenient to pretend he did. "I wasn't taken anywhere," Helena said clearly, making sure her words carried to every soldier in the patrol. "I came here willingly after being rescued from a forced auction where my father was selling me to pay his gambling debts. These people have shown me nothing but kindness and respect." The captain's expression hardened again, and Helena could see him reassessing the situation. A willing departure was much more complicated than a simple kidnapping, both legally and morally. But she could also see that he wasn't prepared to let inconvenient facts interfere with his predetermined course of action. "Miss Ward, I understand you may have developed sympathies for your captors," he said, in the patronizing tone men used when they wanted to dismiss women's opinions. "It's a well-documented phenomenon among kidnapping victims. But you're clearly not thinking rationally. These savages have obviously filled your head with lies and threats." Helena felt a familiar surge of anger at being told her own mind was unreliable. But this time the emotion felt clean and righteous rather than self-destructive. "My mind is perfectly clear, Captain. Clearer than it's been in years. I know the difference between captivity and freedom, between cruelty and kindness. I'm free here in ways I never was in white society. Look at yourself," Captain Thornfield said, gesturing at her traditional dress and braided hair. "They've turned you into one of them, made you forget your own people, your own race. This is exactly the kind of corruption we're here to prevent." Helena looked down at her deerskin dress, beautifully crafted and decorated with symbols that had meaning she was still learning. She thought of the hands that had made it, the women who had welcomed her as a sister, the children who saw past her scars to her heart. "If learning to see myself as worthy of respect and love is corruption," she said quietly, "then I'm grateful to be corrupted." Behind Captain Thornfield, she could see the other soldiers shifting uncomfortably in their saddles. Some of them looked troubled by the conversation, as if they had expected to find a terrified captive begging for rescue rather than a composed woman defending her choices. But she could also see harder faces among them, men who wouldn't care about her wishes, even if they believed them genuine. It was then that Helena noticed a familiar figure among the soldiers, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. Cornelius Blackwood sat his horse near the back of the formation, no longer wearing his expensive civilian clothes, but dressed in military gear that looked borrowed or hastily acquired. His presence here explained everything, from the patrol's aggressive approach to Captain Thornfield's unwillingness to accept her words at face value. "I see you've brought reinforcements," Helena said, her voice carrying a new edge of steel. Tell me, Captain, is it military policy to accept guidance from men like Blackwood when conducting official operations? Captain Thornfield's eyes flicked briefly toward Blackwood before returning to Helena, and she saw guilt flash across his features. Mr. Blackwood has been instrumental in providing information about your whereabouts. He's shown commendable concern for your welfare. Helena's laugh was harsh and bitter.
Concern for my welfare?
Captain, Blackwood was the highest bidder at the auction where my father sold me. His concern extends only to recovering what he considers his purchased property. This revelation sent a visible shock through the patrol, and Helena could see doubt creeping into several faces. Even in the frontier army, where morality was often flexible, the idea of a slave auction involving a white woman crossed lines that many soldiers wouldn't be comfortable defending. That's enough lies from the savage lovers, Blackwood snarled, finally pushing his horse forward to join the confrontation. Captain, you're letting yourself be deceived by Indian trickery. The woman is clearly not in her right mind, corrupted by months of living among heathens. She needs to be taken back to civilization for proper medical treatment. Helena turned to face Blackwood directly, and for the first time since the fire had scarred her face, she felt no urge to hide her damaged features. The man who had once terrified her now seemed smaller somehow, his power diminished by her newfound understanding of her own worth. Treatment for what exactly? She asked with dangerous calm. For learning to value myself? For discovering that my scars don't define my worth? For finding people who see my strength instead of my damage? What medical condition exactly do you think needs treating, Blackwood? Blackwood's face contorted with rage at her defiance. You ungrateful witch! I offered you a home, a purpose, protection from a world that would never accept you as you are. And this is how you repay me? By running off to live like a savage? You offered me slavery, Helena shot back. You saw a broken woman you could exploit and control, someone whose scars made her grateful for any scraps of attention. But I'm not broken anymore, and I'm certainly not grateful to men like you. The confrontation was escalating beyond anyone's control, and Helena could sense the tension building toward an explosion of violence. The Lakota warriors had moved into defensive positions without appearing to do so, while the cavalry soldiers were clearly growing more nervous with each passing moment. One wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, and blood would flow. It was Shappa who broke the deadlock with a suggestion that surprised everyone present. There is a way to settle this matter, according to both white law and Lakota custom, he said, his voice cutting through the rising tension. Let Helena choose her fate in a manner that cannot be questioned by either of our peoples. Captain Thornfield looked suspicious, but interested. What kind of choice? A formal declaration before witnesses from both cultures, Shappa explained. Helena will state her intentions clearly in front of representatives of both our peoples. If she chooses to leave with you, we will not stop her. If she chooses to stay with us, you will respect that decision and leave in peace. And why should we trust the word of savages? Blackwood interjected, but Captain Thornfield held up a hand to silence him. Because, the captain said slowly, if we force her to come with us against her stated wishes, it becomes kidnapping under federal law. And if she makes her choice freely in front of military witnesses, no one can claim she was coerced. Helena could see the calculation behind his words. If she chose to return with the soldiers, the captain would be a hero who rescued a kidnapped white woman. If she chose to stay with the Lakota, he could report that he had given her every opportunity to return, and she had refused, absolving him of further responsibility. I accept those terms, Helena said before anyone else could object. But I want my father here to witness my choice. Since he's the one who started this mess, he should see how it ends. Captain Thornfield nodded slowly. Blackwood, ride back to Fort Bridger and bring Silas Ward here. We'll make camp and wait for his return. But I warn you all, he added, his voice hardening. If this turns out to be some kind of trick, if any harm comes to my men while we're here, I'll burn this village to the ground. No harm will come to your men if they offer no provocation, Shappa replied with quiet dignity. We are a peaceful people who wish only to live in harmony with our neighbors." As the soldiers set up their camp at a respectful distance from the village, Helena found herself surrounded by the Lakota women and children who had become her new family. They didn't question her decision to face this challenge publicly, didn't try to convince her of what choice to make. They simply offered their support and prepared for whatever consequences might follow. "Are you certain about this path?" Winona asked as they sat together in the Elders' Lodge that evening. "Once you make your declaration public, there will be no taking it back. Your choice will follow you for the rest of your life." Helena considered the question carefully, thinking about everything that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a woman without hope, convinced that her scars made her unworthy of love or respect. Now she was surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, rather than how she looked, who had shown her that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. "I've never been more certain of anything," she said finally. "These people saved my life in every way that matters. How can I abandon them now when they need my support?" Winona smiled, her weathered face creasing with approval. "Then tomorrow you will speak your truth, and the consequences will be what they will be. But know that whatever happens, you have already proven your courage and your worth." That night, as Helena lay on her buffalo robes, listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep, she felt a peace that had eluded her for years. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and possibly violence. Her father would arrive with his accusations and demands. Blackwood would try once more to claim her as property, and Captain Thornfield would expect her to choose the familiar over the unknown. But Helena Ward was no longer the broken woman who'd been sold at auction in Fort Bridger. She was a member of the Minikoju band of the Lakota, a woman who had found her strength among people who valued courage over convention. And tomorrow, in front of witnesses from both worlds, she would make that truth known to everyone present. As sleep finally claimed her, Helena's last conscious thought was a prayer to whatever spirits watched over lost souls, finding their way home. She had traveled far from the woman she used to be, and there was no going back now. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of whatever came next, and for the first time in her life, she was ready to face an uncertain future with hope instead of fear. The third day of the standoff dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of the conflict to come. Helena stood at the edge of the village, watching the dust cloud that announced her father's arrival with Blackwood and a handful of additional men. Her hands were steady now, her breathing calm, but inside her chest burned a fire that had been building for 8 long years. Silas Ward looked older and more dissipated than when she had last seen him at the auction. His face puffy and red from drink, his clothes wrinkled and stained. He rode slumped in his saddle, like a man carrying the weight of his own failures, though Helena suspected his greatest regret was losing the gold Shappa had paid for her freedom. Beside him, Blackwood sat straight and predatory, his eyes scanning the village like a wolf looking for weakness. Captain Thornfield had assembled his men in formal parade formation, their uniforms brushed and weapons gleaming in the weak sunlight. The Lakota had gathered in their own ceremonial arrangement, with the elders and war chiefs forming a semicircle that radiated quiet dignity and strength. Between the two groups, a space had been cleared where Helena would make her declaration before witnesses from both worlds. "There she is," Silas Ward called out as soon as he spotted his daughter, his voice carrying the theatrical outrage of a man performing grief rather than feeling it. "My poor child, what have these savages done to you? Look how they've dressed you up like one of them, filled your head with their heathen nonsense." Helena felt the familiar stab of pain that her father's voice always brought, but this time it was different. The pain was clean now, sharp but temporary, like touching a hot stove rather than being slowly burned alive. She walked forward to meet him with her head held high, no longer the cowering girl who had once begged for his approval. "Hello, Father," she said simply, her voice carrying across the silent gathering. "I see you've come to witness my choice, just as Captain Thornfield requested." Silas dismounted awkwardly, his movements clumsy from years of heavy drinking. When he approached Helena, She could smell the whiskey on his breath, even from several feet away. "Choice," he sputtered. "What choice? You're my daughter, my property until you marry, and I say you're coming home where you belong." "I stopped being your property the moment you sold me at auction," Helena replied, with devastating calm. "You gave up any claim to make decisions about my life when you traded me for gambling money." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and Helena could see several of the soldiers shifting uncomfortably as they realized the true nature of the situation they had been drawn into. Captain Thornfield's face had gone carefully blank, the expression of a career officer who suddenly understood he had been manipulated into a morally questionable position. "You ungrateful little witch," Silas snarled, his pretense of paternal concern dropping away like a discarded mask. "After everything I did for you, keeping you fed and housed even after you became too ugly for any decent man to want, this is how you repay me? By running off with savages and making me look like a fool?" "You made yourself look like a fool," Helena said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You made yourself look like a man who would sell his own child to pay for his vices. I didn't run away, Father. I was rescued from the hell you created for me." Blackwood spurred his horse forward, his patience finally exhausted by the verbal sparring. "Enough of this nonsense," he barked. "Captain, the woman is clearly not in her right mind. Her scars have obviously affected her thinking. She needs to be taken back to civilization for proper medical treatment, whether she wants it or not." It was Shappa who responded to this latest threat, stepping forward with the quiet authority of a war chief defending his people. "The woman's mind is clear and her words are true. She has found healing here that your civilization never offered her. What medical treatment do you propose for a spirit that has learned to soar?" "Don't you dare speak to me, savage!" Blackwood snarled, his hand moving toward his weapon. "You kidnapped a white woman and corrupted her mind with your heathen practices. That's a hanging offense in civilized territory." The tension that had been building for 3 days finally snapped like an overstretched rope. Warriors stepped forward to support their chief. Soldiers raised their weapons in response, and for a moment it seemed that blood would inevitably flow across the valley grass. Helena felt time slow around her as she realized that men would die because of her, that the people who had shown her nothing but kindness would pay with their lives for the privilege of protecting her. "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through the rising chaos like a blade through silk. "All of you, just stop." The power in her words surprised even herself, carrying an authority she had never known she possessed. Both groups of armed men paused, weapons half raised, as Helena walked to the center of the clearing, where everyone could see and hear her clearly. "You want to know my choice?" she called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the gathering. "You want to know where I belong and who has the right to claim me? Then listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." She turned first to face her father, this man who had brought her into the world but had never truly been a parent to her. "Silas Ward, you were my father by blood, but you forfeited any claim to that title when you chose whiskey and gambling over your daughter's welfare. You blamed me for my mother's death, blamed me for my scars, blamed me for every misfortune that befell you. You taught me to hate myself, to believe I was worthless, to accept cruelty as my natural lot in life." Silas's face went pale at the public cataloguing of his failures, but Helena wasn't finished with him yet. "When your debts finally caught up with you, you sold me like livestock to pay for your vices. You stood on that platform and told a crowd of strangers that I was worthless, damaged goods fit only for hard labor. You took money for your own flesh and blood and walked away without a backward glance." She turned next to Blackwood, this predator who had seen her vulnerability as an opportunity for exploitation. "And you, Cornelius Blackwood, you saw a broken woman you could purchase and control, someone whose scars made her grateful for any attention, no matter how cruel. You spoke of making me your special project, of having fun with me. You wanted to own a human being for your own twisted pleasure." Blackwood's face was twisted with rage, but Helena's voice rode over his attempted interruption. You enlisted military help not to rescue a kidnapped woman, but to recover what you considered your purchased property. You've manipulated good soldiers into becoming enforcers for your private vendettas. Finally, she turned to address Captain Thornfield and his men. These representatives of the law and order that were supposed to protect the innocent. Captain, you and your men came here believing you were rescuing a captive white woman from savage kidnappers. But what you found instead is a woman who chose freedom over slavery, dignity over degradation, love over hatred. The question you must ask yourselves is this: will you use your authority to enforce justice, or will you become tools of oppression? The silence that followed her words was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the valley and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Helena could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, could sense the shifting emotions of the crowd as her words sank in and changed the fundamental nature of the confrontation. "My choice is this," she continued, her voice now steady as stone. "I choose the people who saw past my scars to my spirit. I choose the community that valued my strength over my damage. I choose the culture that taught me I was worthy of respect and love. I choose Shapa, who knelt before a scarred and broken woman and saw not damaged goods, but a warrior who had survived the fire." She walked to Shapa's side, taking his offered hand with a gesture that spoke louder than any words. "I choose the Lakota as my people, this valley as my home, and this man as my husband if he will have me. I reject the world that taught me to hate myself, the society that saw me as property to be bought and sold, the civilization that measured my worth by my appearance rather than my character." The declaration sent shockwaves through both groups of witnesses, though the reactions were dramatically different. Among the Lakota, there were smiles and nods of approval, a collective sense that justice had been served and honor upheld. Among the soldiers, the reactions were more mixed, ranging from grudging respect to confused anger to simple relief that they wouldn't have to use force against people they were beginning to respect. Captain Thornfield was the first to break the stunned silence, his voice carefully neutral as he processed the implications of what he had just witnessed. "Miss Ward, you understand that this choice is irrevocable? That if you remain here, you'll be considered to have abandoned your citizenship and all the protections that come with it." "I understand perfectly," Helena replied without hesitation. "I'm trading the protection of laws that failed to protect me for the loyalty of people who actually care about my welfare." "I'd call that an excellent bargain." Silas Ward finally found his voice, though it cracked with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You can't do this, Helena. You're my daughter, my blood. These people are savages, heathens, enemies of our race. You'll be throwing away everything civilized, everything Christian, everything decent." Helena's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Decent? You want to lecture me about decency, father? These savages welcomed me as family. These heathens taught me that I had value beyond my usefulness to men. These enemies showed me more Christian charity in 3 weeks than I received in 8 years of your so-called civilization." "You'll regret this," Blackwood snarled, his face purple with frustrated rage. "When winter comes and these animals can't protect you, when their primitive ways leave you sick and starving, you'll come crawling back begging for civilized treatment. And when you do, I'll make sure you remember the price of defying your betters." It was this threat that finally pushed Shapa beyond the limits of his diplomatic patience. In one fluid motion, he stepped between Blackwood and Helena, his hand resting on the war club at his belt. "You will not threaten my woman again," he said with deadly quiet. "She has made her choice freely and with honor. Any man who cannot respect that choice has no honor himself." The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge for several heartbeats, predator and protector measuring each other for signs of weakness or opportunity. But it was Captain Thornfield who ultimately diffused the situation. His practical military mind, recognizing that continuing the conflict served no useful purpose. "The matter is settled," he announced with the authority of federal law behind his words. "Helena Ward has made her choice freely and before witnesses. She remains here by her own will, not as a captive, but as a voluntary resident. Any further attempts to coerce her departure will be considered kidnapping under territorial law. Blackwood's face went through several interesting color changes as he processed this official declaration. But even his arrogance wasn't quite strong enough to challenge military authority directly. Silas Ward simply stood there swaying slightly, looking like a man who had just lost his last chance at redemption and wasn't quite sure how it had happened. As the soldiers prepared to depart, Captain Thornfield approached Helena one final time, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. "I hope you've made the right choice, Miss Ward. This is a hard country, and the life you're choosing won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is," Helena replied with a smile that transformed her scarred features into something radiant. "But for the first time in my life, I'm choosing difficulty over degradation, challenge over chains. I'd rather face an uncertain future with people who love me than a guaranteed misery with people who don't." The captain nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his weathered features. "Then may God go with you wherever your path leads." As the cavalry patrol rode away, taking with them the last representatives of Helena's old life, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The confrontation she had dreaded for weeks was over, and she had emerged not just victorious, but transformed. She was no longer Helena Ward, the scarred and damaged daughter of a gambling drunk. She was simply Helena, beloved of Shapa, daughter of the Lakota, home at last. 6 months had passed since the cavalry patrol departed, leaving Helena to forge her new life among the Lakota people. The changing seasons had brought their own challenges and rewards, each day teaching her something new about herself and the world she had chosen to join. Winter's harsh grip had given way to spring's gentle awakening, and with it came a transformation in Helena that went far deeper than the surface changes anyone could observe. The woman who now moved confidently through the village bore little resemblance to the broken creature who had once cowered on an auction platform. Her skin had been bronzed by sun and wind, her hands strengthened by honest work, her body made lean and strong by the physical demands of frontier life. But the most dramatic change was in her eyes, which now sparkled with life and purpose instead of reflecting the dead hopelessness that had once defined her existence. Helena had thrown herself into learning the ways of her adopted people with the passion of someone who had finally found her true calling. Under Winona's patient guidance, she had mastered the intricate beadwork that decorated clothing and sacred objects, her scarred fingers proving surprisingly nimble at the delicate craft. Ayana had taught her the properties of healing plants and the songs that accompanied their gathering, knowledge that connected her to the spiritual traditions of the Lakota in ways that transcended language and culture. Most importantly, she had learned to speak Lakota with increasing fluency, the musical cadences of the language flowing from her lips like poetry. The children delighted in correcting her pronunciation and teaching her new words, their laughter creating a soundtrack of joy that followed her through her daily tasks. Even the most traditional elders had come to accept her presence, recognizing in her dedication and respect for their ways a sincerity that could not be faked. But it was her relationship with Shapa that had undergone the most profound evolution during these months of growth and discovery. What had begun as a rescue had deepened into a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and a love that grew stronger with each passing day. They had taken their time, allowing trust to build naturally without the pressure of expectations or the shadow of Helena's painful past. The formal marriage ceremony had taken place during the spring celebration, when the entire village gathered to honor the return of life to the world. Helena had worn a dress crafted by the women of the tribe, its white deerskin decorated with blue and red beadwork that told the story of her journey from despair to hope. Shapa had stood beside her in his finest regalia, eagle feathers in his hair and traditional paint marking his face with symbols of strength and protection. The ceremony itself had been unlike anything from Helena's former world, emphasizing the joining of two spirits rather than the legal transfer of property from father to husband. Elder Red Cloud had spoken words that bound them not just to each other, but to the community that surrounded them, making their union a celebration of love that strengthened the entire tribe rather than diminishing anyone involved. Now, as summer reached its peak and the valley bloomed with wildflowers that painted the landscape in brilliant colors, Helena found herself facing a new kind of transformation. She had been feeling strange for several weeks. A combination of fatigue and nausea that initially worried her until Winona's knowing smile suggested a different explanation entirely. "The morning sickness will pass," the old woman had said, with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen countless women through the early stages of pregnancy. "But the joy that comes after will last a lifetime." Helena had wept when Winona confirmed what she had begun to suspect, though these were tears of overwhelming happiness rather than the bitter sorrow that had once been her constant companion. The idea that she could create new life, that her body could nurture and protect a child despite all the damage it had endured, seemed like a miracle beyond anything she had dared to hope for. When she told Shappa the news, his reaction had been everything she could have wished for and more. His normally stoic demeanor had cracked completely, revealing a joy so pure and profound that it took her breath away. He had lifted her carefully in his arms, spinning her around while laughing with delight. Before setting her down and placing both hands gently on her still flat belly, "Our child will know only love," he had whispered, his voice thick with emotion. No cruel words, no harsh judgments, no shame about their appearance or their heritage. They will grow up knowing they are wanted, valued, and protected by people who would die before allowing harm to come to them. The promise had meant more to Helena than all the gold in the world, representing not just security for their unborn child, but validation of the choices that had brought them to this moment. She thought of her own childhood, poisoned by her father's resentment and cruelty, and felt fierce determination that no child of hers would ever experience such rejection. As her pregnancy progressed and began to show, Helena found herself becoming something of a celebrity within the village. Pregnant women were considered especially blessed by the spirits, and everyone seemed eager to share in the joy of new life coming into their community. The children were particularly fascinated, constantly asking questions about the baby and offering to help with whatever tasks might be needed. "Will the baby look like you or like Shappa?" little Tacha asked one afternoon as they gathered berries together in the hills above the village. Helena smiled at the innocent question, thinking of all the complications it represented. "The baby will look like both of us," she said carefully. "And they will be beautiful no matter what features they inherit. Will they have marks like yours?" Tacha continued with the fearless curiosity of childhood. Helena touched her scarred cheek thoughtfully. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But if they do, they will learn that scars are proof of survival, evidence of strength. They will never be taught to be ashamed of their appearance." It was a conversation that stayed with her as the months passed and her body changed to accommodate the new life growing within her. Helena often found herself talking to her unborn child, sharing the stories and songs she was learning, promising adventures and security in equal measure. The baby seemed to respond to these conversations, kicking more vigorously when she sang or spoke in Lakota, as if already recognizing the language of their people. The birth came in late autumn, when the leaves had turned brilliant gold and red, painting the valley in colors that seemed to celebrate the arrival of new life. Helena had labored through the night with Winona and Ayana attending her, their skilled hands and soothing voices providing comfort during the most intense hours of pain and effort. When the baby finally emerged into the world, crying lustily and demanding attention, Helena felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. The child was perfect, with Shappa's dark hair and strong features, but Helena's grey-green eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom even in their first moments of life. "A daughter," Winona announced with satisfaction, placing the cleaned and wrapped infant in Helena's arms. She will be a warrior like her mother, strong and brave and beautiful. Helena stared down at her daughter's face, marveling at the tiny perfection of her features and the fierce grip of her small fists. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "Welcome to the world. You are so loved, so wanted, so precious." When Shapa was allowed into the lodge to meet his daughter, his expression transformed into something Helena knew she would remember for the rest of her life. This strong warrior, who had faced cavalry soldiers and hostile enemies without flinching, was brought to tears by the sight of his tiny daughter sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. "She is perfect," he said in wondering tones, reaching out to stroke the baby's soft cheek with one gentle finger. "What shall we call her?" Helena had been thinking about names throughout her pregnancy, wanting to choose something that honored both cultures while being beautiful in its own right. "I was thinking Ayana Ohitika," she said softly. "Eternal Blossom the Brave." Shapa's smile was radiant as he considered the name. In Lakota tradition, names carried deep significance, often reflecting the hopes and dreams parents held for their children. "Ayana Ohitika," he repeated, testing the sound. "Yes, that is perfect. She will grow strong and bloom eternally, like the love that brought her into being." As the seasons turned and little Ayana grew from infant to toddler, Helena marveled at how completely her life had been transformed. The child was indeed growing up knowing only love and acceptance, surrounded by a community that valued her mixed heritage as a bridge between two worlds rather than a source of confusion or shame. Ayana's first words had been a mixture of English and Lakota, reflecting the bilingual household in which she was being raised. She called Helena Mama, but Shapa At, the Lakota word for father, and seemed equally comfortable with both languages as she developed her vocabulary. The village children adored her, including her in their games and treating her as a beloved little sister. One afternoon, as Helena watched her 3-year-old daughter playing with a group of children by the river, she felt a presence beside her and turned to find Winona settling onto the grass with the careful movements of advancing age. The old woman's eyes were bright with wisdom and affection as she observed the playing children. "Do you ever regret your choice?" Winona asked quietly, her gaze still fixed on the children's games. Helena considered the question seriously, thinking back over the years that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the auction platform where her father had sold her, the terror she had felt at Blackwood's threats, the moment when Shapa had knelt before her and promised protection. She thought of all the pain and shame she had carried for so long, and how completely it had been replaced by joy and purpose. "Never," she said with absolute conviction. "Not for a single moment. This life, this love, this family, this community, it's everything I never dared to dream I could have." Winona nodded with satisfaction. The spirits knew what they were doing when they guided Shapa to that auction. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most painful packages, and it takes courage to unwrap them and claim what was always meant to be ours. As the sun began to set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Helena called to her daughter, "Ayana, time to come home for supper." The little girl came running, her dark braids flying behind her and her face bright with the pure joy of childhood. She launched herself into Helena's arms with the absolute trust of a child who had never known rejection or cruelty, who had been loved from her first breath and would be loved until her last. Walking back to their lodge with her daughter chattering happily in her arms and Shapa's strong presence beside her, Helena reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. She had traveled from the depths of despair to the heights of joy, from believing she was unworthy of love to being surrounded by it in abundance. The scars on her face remained, and they always would. But they no longer defined her or limited her possibilities. They were simply part of her story, proof of her survival and strength, evidence of how far she had traveled from the broken woman she had once been. In learning to love herself as she was, she had opened her heart to receiving love from others, creating a cycle of healing that had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky and the sounds of the village settled into evening routines, Elena Ward, now Helena Winya brave woman, knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home at last. Love had conquered all the forces that had tried to destroy her, and in choosing to trust in that love, she had claimed a destiny more beautiful than anything she could have imagined in her darkest hours. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.